In this video, we're going to take a time out to replace the lower ball joint for the left side double wishbone independent suspension. So we are finished with replacing the stabilizer link and the stabilizer bar support mount. So this will not cause any issue with the suspension. Before, with the broken stabilizer link or the loose stabilizer link, it will cause the suspension to bounce up and down, promoting an uneven wear to the tire. Now we must fix this lower control arm ball joint so we could maintain suspension control. Let's take a look at this video and you will see when this side of the control arm suspension hits a bump, how it loses control for a brief moment and then regain control of the road. Let's get ready to install a ball joint like this into the lower control arm. And this is the nut that detaches. But you're going to want to reconsider installing an inferior ball joint like this and compared to one like this. You see, this is a Moog ball joint, and this company sets the standard in suspension engineer. I'm not getting paid to promote this company. I've been using these products all my life, which is approximately 35 years in the mechanic industry, with great success. When you look at this inferior ball joint, it's brand new. You can see how thin the alloy is in compared to the Moog. Plus, you get a better nut to hold the ball joint in position. You also notice the Moog has a spline fitted to it instead of this smooth, crappy fitting. So we're going to use this, and it also has a grease fitting so the ball joint could last you a lifetime in the vehicle. This does not have that. This one is going to keep you buying. So this is the best way to go. And here I have the socket that we're going to use for removing this nut. So this socket is 1 inch and 7/8. You're going to have to purchase this essentially for this removal, but this one is made specifically for this ball joint, and it's a little bigger than the nut on this ball joint, this one here. So I had to buy a reducer, which is 1/2 inch, which is 3/4 to 1/2 inch. So this is a 3/4 inch socket. So I would just fit this in here and then I could use my 1/2-inch breaker bar to remove the nut. But I don't want to remove the nut yet. I just want to take this chisel and lean back the notches that locks the nut onto the ball joint. Here is what you should be looking at. So you see how the fore ear is leaned back inward to make easy removal for the nut. Let's get some penetrating oil to make the removal easy and resistant free. So this is my 1/2-inch breaker bar. It's about 2 feet tall. I have to put some muscle into this. So we are successful at removing the nut that holds the ball joint in position. Now I just want to take the hammer, preferably the pointed side, because we don't want to damage the threads. You can give this to a friend who cannot afford a new ball joint so he can get through. That is what we want. You could always replace this with a new grease boot. Clean out the grease and fill it with new, and it's just as inferior as this one. Let's use the good old purple blaster. The container sitting below. I don't want to catch all this grime. Take a little brush, just clean up in here. Put some water in another can, spray it down. You don't want to use too much water, because then you're going to wet up all over the place, and next thing you know, you're going to be laying in a mess looking like a dog. So always clean and stay clean. So we're going to let that dry. Now let's give it some bling. I want to make it look good. If it was up to me, I would paint the whole control arm. But you see this paint, So this paint is insurance. What it does, it's basically going to create a seal for us inside that hole when we decide to press the ball joint up into its fitted circumference. So we just want to take some grease and we're going to apply it on the spline section of the ball joint, because this spline is basically going to bite itself into the side, and this is what's going to hold the ball joint sturdy inside the control arm. Now when we look at this ball joint, it has to be installed in a predetermined direction because of this grease fitting. We don't want this grease fitting to face forward, because all the dust and particle is going to crash into the grease ball, and that's going to cause a problem greasing the ball joint. We don't want to have it face the rear because we don't have clearance on the edge of the lower control arm. So we will have to face the grease nipple inwards. So this is going to be a little tough to fit, but the easiest way to do this is just to put the nut back on the ball joint itself. So if you have a big enough C-clamp, you can simply place the socket back on top of the control arm, joist the C-clamp on top of the socket and the ball joint, and you could draw the ball joint into the lower control arm. But since this C-clamp is not big enough, we're going to have to resort to another solution. Here is the best setup that I could create for starting the installation of the ball joint to the lower control arm. We will simply turn the C-clamp, and this will draw the ball joint into its installment hole. But you're going to have to be careful with this. So the only reason we did what we just did is so we could have a start on this nut. We always want to make sure we check the area where we're installing the ball joint. So this ball joint is actually should be pressed into position instead of using the screw to draw it into position. So I'm just going to flip the nut around because it has a bevel edge to cater for the curve, because I don't want this sharp edge to be cutting into the ball joint. Here is how you're going to know that the installation is finalized. You will notice the nut seat below this surface of the ball joint. When we look at the other one for the other side, you can see with the nut fully installed, it will leave this gap in between for the sheet metal on the lower control arm to compress itself. So what we're going to do now is to secure this nut to the ball joint. Check under the control arm to make sure that the ball joint is seated perfectly against the control arm and the grease nipple is pointing inwards, so it will be easy to lube the ball joint during service. We must now remove the nut once again. See all that metal shaving? Well, that will contribute to corrosion and eat away at the joint where the ball joint is pressed into the control arm. So we must clean this area with some carb cleaner, or preferably brake cleaner. Then we want to dry it. We're going to use a roll of masking tape. This is going to protect the threads. We don't want to get paint on the threads because we're going to have to torque the nut for the ball joint. So by covering the threads is an effort to give us a true torque when we're ready to torque the nut. So the paint is the only line of defense and protection from corrosion. Paint is dry and we could remove the masking tape. I want to place some tread lock on the threads, mostly inside of the nut. So this is basically duplicating what the engineer did to the nut by punching it in the four corners to lock the nut to the ball joint. Now we will torque this nut to the factory recommendation. And that has finalized the installation of the lower ball joint.